Hello, you're listening to Wine Blast. Welcome back to Santorini, the magical and mysterious island where we took you in our last episode. In that one, we set the scene. Now we're going to dive into the wines and the food, as well as look to the future.
Yes, hello. And I think a quick recap might be in order, don't you?
Good idea.
So this is a really critical moment in Santorini's long history. In our last episode, we heard how this parched volcanic outcrop of an island in the middle of the Aegean Sea became a prosperous and cosmopolitan hub within the Mediterranean, with its wine already a famous asset and key trading commodity some 4,000 years ago. And yet recently this long and proud wine history has come under threat, with the island's vineyard dwindling, having halved since the 1980s and down by a third since just 2005.
Yeah, now the notion of Santorini's ancient vineyard being lost is just too unutterably sad. It's this place totally unique. It's immune from the phylloxera vine pest because of its distinctive volcanic soils, and these are thought to be some of the oldest vines on the planet, planted on their own roots, unlike most other vines around the world, and they're cultivated in a very rare coulura basket formation to protect from wind and sun. But the relentless march of tourism and its associated lucrative development is proving just too tempting for many vineyard owners, who often prefer to sell up rather than persist with the punishing calculus of vineyard labour and marginal profitability.
And that's not even to mention the challenges of climate change, is it? But I said at the start that this is a critical moment, and that's because when we visited the island, we got a clear sense that this is the moment when Santorini's proud and resilient wine community is starting to fight back, to reassert wine's rightful historic place on the island, to retain the history and stake a claim for a brighter future. Do we feel that's Hollywood enough as a setup? What do you reckon?
It's pretty Hollywood.
Good?
It's pretty good. I mean, you know, you could maybe throw in something a bit more like, you know, it was a time for heroes. You know, so it's a bit more of that. Maybe throw in a Marvel character or two. You know, Captain Santorini. I feel this is the place and time. Apart from that, very good. Like it. Build that tension, that drama.
The setup.
On that note, though, how about we hear Santorini summed up by the very wine people we're talking about on the island?
You know, you cannot easily sit in a taverna, enjoy a fresh fish, and have a glass of wine from vines that are 500 years old.
It's like a Jurassic Park of the vineyards, because it's one of the most ancient vineyards of the world.
Santorini is sort of the mecca of wine in Greece.
You're having basically the personality of an active volcano in your glass.
Sometimes you need the help of God, and there are times in Santorini that we feel like we are a little bit forgotten by God.
It was like discovering Atlantis.
Santorini is jewel in the crown. You up there, you're on Champions League, you know, you're not playing on the local league, you know.
So there we've got everything from Hollywood to God, so we're covering all bases. But coming back to what you were rightly saying about Santorini's wine producers fighting back, you know, part of that work is behind the scenes, isn't it? So things like applying to UNESCO for potential cultural monument status, plans to declare the entire PDO Santorini wine appellation organic, raising prices to incentivise grape growers to stick with wine rather than sell off their land. You know, and we explored all of this in our last episode.
Yeah, but of course, I mean, the ultimate reckoning will come in the form of the wine in your glass. Are these wines good enough to survive? Are they delicious and characterful and unique enough to merit our time, effort and money to support this cause? And that's what we're going to get into in this episode, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what it's all about ultimately, isn't it? The wine. So I'm already on the record as having unilaterally declared Santorini Assyrtiko to be one of my all-time favourite wines. Also the ultimate food wine. So I think it's pretty clear
where you stand,
where I stand on this. But all of this will, of course, be up for discussion. This is a democratic podcast. Before we get going in earnest, though, I did want to mention just a couple of things.
Oh, really?
What?
Well, in my head, I'm already on the island with my glass ready to be filled. So just be quick. Yeah?
I think you're
I wanna
always
get going.
on an island in your head, waiting for your glass to be
In the sunshine, on a terrace.
Yeah, and you're always wanting me to be quick, so nothing changes. Anyway, it's well, mostly. Anyway, this is just a very brief mention of the fact that this is, and I do need a bit of a drum roll at this point.
Okay,
so I'm
here
going to call him.
Here you go.
Oh,
Ready?
Go on.
Go.
That's a fantastic drum roll. Your best yet. It sounds like it hurt your hands.
It's not patronising at all.
Oh no, it wasn't patronising. It was genuine praise.
Surprise.
Anyway, I'll show. This is our 100th episode of Wine Blast. How about that?
Woohoo!
Here we are. Who knew? I only found out.
I didn't know,
because I
actually.
clicked on the wrong thing and it told me you're on 99. So this is our 100th episode. There we go.
Woo.
Now, we never really need an excuse to raise a glass, but I reckon that's a pretty bona fide reason.
Yeah,
What do you
fair
think?
enough. Wow. I mean,
know.
actually, wow. Well, I think we all deserve to celebrate this moment because this podcast simply wouldn't exist without your fantastic support. You're taking the time to tune in on a regular basis and help keep the show growing and spreading the gospel of wine. So thank you. And cheers all round.
Yeah, everything from Hollywood to God on this show. We did say it. Now, where were we? Right. So, yes, this is the stage where we need to say that this Santorini Focus is a 2-part mini-series we're doing in collaboration with Wines of PDO Santorini. Now, for the sake of total clarity, what we do with our sponsored episodes is come up with an idea of a program we want to make, talk to generic sponsors, never individual producers, and then they support us to make the shows.
Yeah. And do you know what? It's really important to be clear that we always insist on editorial independence, don't we? So and I think that's probably apparent from the various sponsored episodes we've done so far.
Yeah.
You know, the sponsors really just help make the programme happen rather than dictate anything that's said.
Yeah. Now, one exception is in these Santorini episodes, we were encouraged not to mention individual producer brand names, I suppose. And we agreed because we thought that the overall story was intriguing and strong enough by itself. So that's why we're not going to be going into any great detail on that front, in case you're wondering.
I don't know, enough of the practicalities. We want to know more about Santorini's wines, don't we? So let's zoom straight in on what is surely the ace in Santorini's wine pack, the Assyrtiko grape variety. Now, this ancient, indigenous white wine variety has been called many things. Fearsome, brutal, majestic, epic, heroic, intense, multidimensional, and even polydynamic. These were all terms we heard used to describe it on our visit to the island.
Yeah, and here's me thinking that was just people talking, being complimentary about me.
Fearsome.
I was taking it all as me. Fearsome,
Multidimensional.
No one's ever called me polydynamic before, so that should have made me realise.
Peter Dynamic.
Selective hearing, selective interpretation. Anyway, you know, it's an interesting one, Assyrtiko, isn't it? As a wine lover, your natural instinct is always to try to compare wines to your established context, isn't it? So, you know, but with Assyrtiko, it's really hard to do that. And that's quite telling, quite instructive in itself. So you might compare it to a sort of well-structured Albarino, but it's more mineral and sort of sturdy, isn't it? You know, or maybe Hunter Semillon, but it's much more full-bodied than that.
Yeah, or dry Riesling, but it's less appley and aromatic, or dry ferment, but in truth, it's different in character from all of these. Because a really good dry Santorini Assyrtiko will never be aromatic, certainly not fruit forward. I mean, it can perhaps have a bit of citrus or peach rind and smoky or stony hints, but really its beauty is on the palate. You know, it's vibrant acidity, mouth-filling structure, really intense, persistent presence, and always a salty, savoury lick on the finish to complement its freshness. Very age-worthy and brilliant with all kinds of food, as you were saying.
So you agree with my ultimate food wine claim? Is that it? Is that the official seal of approval for Susie Barry?
It's definitely one of the most versatile food wines on the planet. You know, I'm going to throw in Chablis as a more classic, incredibly versatile match.
Yeah.
You know, but anyway. I would have to agree, it is pretty sensational with food. It really is. And we've tried it, haven't we, with so many things. I mean, from all kinds of seafood, even with very rich sauces, to pork and chicken and red meat.
Yeah.
You know, certainly everything on Santorini, from the
Yes.
intense local tomato paste to the fava bean purees, grilled octopus, anchovies, white aubergine. Anchovies are not easy to match, are they?
No.
But white aubergine and lamb, and it kind of works pretty well with pretty much anything.
It just does.
You
really
know,
does.
especially I think when we're talking about the more complex, well-rounded styles of Assyrtiko.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, just to back this up, I think we should hear from wine producer and academic Yanis Paraskivopoulos. I asked him why people should drink Santorini Assyrtiko.
If there is one reason, I would say how unexpectedly food-driven those wines are. It's crazy. The pairing that you can achieve with those wines, it's so broad, and you can go bold. Really, I'm not saying Assyrtiko and oysters, which on its own, it is probably the summit of pairing that a person can achieve in life. But for us, this is obvious. You can go from those North Pacific oysters all the way to a very fatty meat, a very fatty lamb. And it works. It does work. And it works for many reasons. One, they're not aromatic, but they are stubborn. These hard to identify aromas of Assyrtiko of Santorini. So it respects the aromas of many of our recipes. But then it is the pH. It's the low pH. And then the real salinity that those wines do have, because basically there is sodium coming from the sea that lies on the berries. It doesn't come from the soil. It's the wind, as I said, how the wind influences the taste, because it brings the salt. So they are tasty wines because of this bloody salt. And that boosts minerality. And then also that it's very, very, very rare to have a white wine that behaves like a red. Why? Well, if I would tell you, listen, if there's a wine that you can age it for 20 years, you can definitely propose it with red meat, without telling you what I'm talking about. In your head, you're picturing already a big red. And Assyrtiko, not only it has the vehicle for aging, which is the low pH, but it's a very tannic variety. You can chew those tannins. So it is a white wine that behaves like a red wine, and that on its own, it's quite an odd condition. And to finish up, the oldest Assyrtiko I've ever tasted in my life was bottled. I'm sure you won't believe me. You will go, oh, there's again a southern that speaks, that exaggerates, as southerns tend to do. It was bottled in 1847. We popped the bottle in the year 2000. 10 winemakers from Santorini were in front of this bottle of a wine that was 153 years old. And the wine was very much alive.
1847. Oh, I mean, that would have been amazing to taste, wouldn't it? But the thing is, you can tell just by tasting these wines that they can and will age. You know, they're pretty fearsome and intense when they're young, but you've got all the concentration and the balance that you need to age brilliantly.
Yeah, and those are some of the qualities that enable it to go so well with food too, aren't they? The qualities that enable it to age. By the way, Yanis mentioned low pH, something we also touched on in our last episode. And we should explain that for those wondering, low pH by and large correlates to high acidity. It's not an exact correspondence, but it is linked. And that's maybe the easiest way of putting it and understanding it. And we've always found, on that note, it's the wines with the best natural acidity, the freshest, crispest natural acidity that tend to work the best with food, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. But then with Santorini Assyrtiko, its secret weapon, as Yanis says, is that salty edge to the finish. You know, I think it comes in, as they say, off the sea breeze and mist.
Yeah,
it's
salt,
deposited on the berries and then makes it into the ferments, obviously. I mean, that's sort of intriguing,
yeah, we're
isn't
talking
it?
about real salt,
yeah,
from the sea that's getting into the wines. I mean,
Actually
so
in the wines.
I guess it's part of the terroir.
You'd have to say so, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Yeah, the place's sort of unique identity. You know, we talk about minerality in wine, and that's a tricky term because it means different things to different people. Usually, minerality is a metaphor. You know, it refers to a sort of aromatic quality beyond fruit or herbs or obvious things. You know, and sometimes that can be the result of positive sulfides thrown up in the fermentation, which can be referred to as reduction as well, and which can often be evident in Santorini Assyrtiko. But in this particular case, it's literal minerality. Salt, sodium chloride, is a mineral. And in these wines, it's there and you can taste it.
Yeah, yeah.
I
mean, to be honest, though, I think we might be doing a whole episode on minerality, so maybe let's not go down that particular rabbit hole here. But the salt angle is fascinating. Even with the sweet vinsantos, you know, which we're going to come on to, there's a kind of salted caramel lick, which again means they're not too sickly, and they also go really well with food. You know, like blue cheese, for example. Well, I suppose that's if you can actually eat them with anything, because they're almost a meal in themselves, aren't they?
Okay. Let's hold those exact thoughts, because I want to bring in Lito Paraskevopoulos, Yanis's daughter, and the next generation to lead the family's production of Santorini wines. Now, we interviewed Lito by the sea, which you might be able to hear in the background. Her unique accent also needs prefacing because she studied biochemistry and molecular biology. I can't even say it, molecular biology. That's why she's so much cleverer than I am. She studied those in Leeds and Newcastle in the UK and had lots of Irish and Scottish friends. And I hope that prefaces.
Well, I think you'll be able to hear what we mean. Anyway, we started by asking Lito, who's very young herself, if the younger generation is coming through on Santorini and whether they're sticking with tradition or are keen to do something new.
So I think it's a mix of both. So yes, first of all, there is a lot of the younger generation coming in right now. In some cases, it's second, third generation. From the very families that started the wineries here. It is very much the case that a lot of the younger people that have studied enology do come to Santorini to practice the job. And that's because Santorini is sort of the mecca of wine in Greece. And so there's a lot of people, let's say, between the ages of 22 and 35 or 40. Pretty much everybody wants to come through here, everybody that works in production especially. So there's very much the element of sticking with tradition, but up to a point, because there is a lot of traditional styles, of course. There's been winemaking here for as long as we know, but we like to try and mix those traditional styles with more modern techniques, of course. Also in terms of being experimental, because we're blessed with such a great variety here, so robust and so polydynamic, we call it, fancy word. So it's very interesting to see just how far we can take it. So we've not found the upper limit yet. So.
And what kind of innovation or new techniques are people using? Is there something specific you would highlight?
So we would work with different types of media. So there's always been, let's say, barrels, because of course they've been around for longer than stainless steel tanks. But the tradition here was big, very old barrels. So right now, a lot of people are experimenting with different types of woods, newer oak, so bringing in a more kind of New World style, pairing it up with the traditional, more rustic style. So that's one thing. The other thing would be, well, clay obviously is a big thing right now. Seems to be working very, very well with Assyrtiko.
So and that would be amphora style or eggs?
Amphora style, yeah, and eggs. And cement tanks even as well. They work really, really well with the style. Another thing would be, of course, different types of yeasts. A lot of experimentation with native yeasts, obviously. So a lot of people have been isolating them. We've also been working with wild type yeast for a while now, since 2008.
Just to finish off on the experimentation, you mentioned floor. You'd like to experiment making wines with floor. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right now, the trend is for lower alcohol, but Santorini speaks for high alcohol. So we're very south. We have a lot of sun. So by the time that we harvest, the grapes are really, really quite mature and with a lot of sugar. So a lot of potential alcohol, and indeed a lot of alcohol by the end. So back in the day, traditional wines were north of 16%. So right now that's illegal. So we do try to keep them below 15, but that's what the island wants to do. And that's what also the variety wants to do, because Assyrtiko at least is a variety that matures very early on. So with that comes, of course, the possibility of working with floor. It helps also that with this high alcohol, you can get left with a little bit, tiny little bit of residual sugars, just enough to support the growth of floor as well. And so another thing with high alcohol that comes, so sorry about the chemistry, but it's VA, not to the point that it becomes a fault. We associate VA with wineness.
So this is volatile acidity.
This is volatile acidity.
Lots of ferments, but can affect some wines more than others, and in excess it's a fault.
So it's not exactly. Same with everything, even with reduction. So reduction has a bad rap, but in Santorini, healthy reduction is linked to our mineral character in aging. So we do go after that style as well. The floor thing would be the opposite. So it would be working with the rustic kind of oxidative style. And so when we talk about aging, because of course we have great aging potential here, floor would be a great way to manage volatile acidity in a very natural way without being worried. To me, it's peace of mind. You feel protected, and you can make a high alcohol wine in the traditional style without having to worry about all the other things that can happen.
So talking about the different flavours that you get from the different techniques and whatnot, I know you have a theory about the saltiness. Tell us about that.
Okay, so basically we are a tiny speck of land in a whole lot of sea, and it is very windy. Anybody can tell you that. We're actually very lucky right now. So yeah, well done. So it's literal salt from the sea mist, we call it, or sea breeze or whatever. That gets blown onto the land and onto the grapes. So, of course, we don't wash the grapes before we press them because that's a big, big no-no. And so the salt literally makes it into the wine. Also, and so we did the experiment actually. Because we also work with Assyrtiko in Nemea, and Assyrtiko is planted everywhere in Greece actually. And so we measured sodium in Assyrtiko from Santorini and Assyrtiko from Nemea, and we found that Santorini Assyrtiko had 215% more sodium than Nemea Assyrtiko. Of course, then that is analogous to sodium chloride, which is plain old salt. So it's 3 times more than mainland.
So is that contributing to a saltiness, a minerality in the wine itself?
Absolutely. And so that is one of the key characteristics of our wines, that they are tiny bit salty, which makes them more food driven, but it's more like food itself, you know.
So a bottle of Santorini Assyrtiko is a meal in itself.
It's savory, yeah. They're rich and they're salty and they're acidic and perfectly balanced and with a lot of alcohol. Can't see anything that you can go wrong with there. So.
So a bottle of Santorini Assyrtiko is a meal in itself. Now there's a marketing strapline if there was one.
Yeah.
Though I guess the responsible health community might have something to say.
Yes, nice practical picnic though. You know, just in just one bottle, there you go. Now, Lito picked up on the point about salt in the wines, didn't she? Interesting, the experiment they did. And Yanis is a microbiologist and Lito's a biochemist, so they kind of know what they're talking about in this sense, don't they?
Now, I thought it was interesting and quite positive what she was saying about the fact that the younger generation are coming to the island and that they're kind of reinventing the wines for the modern era.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think it's vital for Santorini's future that happens. You know, I guess just sort of carry on this thought in terms of history and tradition. You know, I guess the sweet Vinsanto is the most historic wine style on the island, and there are other traditional styles like Nicteri, which we'll come back to. But you know, while on the one hand they're retaining those historic styles, on the other they're introducing new things like orange wine.
Yes. Orange Santorini Assyrtiko. That was an interesting experience, wasn't it? So we should probably just say for those who aren't familiar with orange wines, these are white wines made like red wine. So macerating the juice with the skins, and that gives it a sort of an orange hue and a more tannic body, if you like, to the wine. And it was quite funny because we quite liked the orange wine Lito had made. But she wasn't so keen, was she? She described the whole orange wine thing as a fad.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, when a producer is the one criticising their own wine. I think what had happened is they'd made it and they weren't sure about it, but the demand proved to be massive and now they can't stop. Anyway, but I think their concern is mainly a winemaking one and a quality one. Is that Assyrtiko is already quite a potent and phenolic variety, so to then macerate with the skins, it can make for a pretty fearsome orange wine. So they do theirs very gently, and actually, we quite liked it.
Yeah. Now I'm intrigued by the concept of flor, though. So this is the technique used on Fino sherry, for example, or on some vin jaune from Jura, where a veil of yeast grows on top of the wine while it's maturing in barrel and gives it a distinctive salty, nutty character. Now that could be really interesting as another way of developing Santorini's offering.
Yeah, I completely agree. It would be really interesting to see flor, more flor. Yeah, and she also touched on alcohol, didn't she? We did notice when we were there that the alcohol levels in the wines can be pretty high, and I definitely think higher than last time we visited and what it used to be in the past.
Yeah.
But you don't tend to notice it because of the high acidity and full-bodied style of dry Santorini Assyrtiko tends to carry it. But it is definitely something to be aware of, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes it did, as you say, get out of kilter when the alcohol was so high. It made the wine just too hard and sort of austere. So I think it's an issue winemakers will need to be careful with, especially as things warm up with climate change, and then find ways to cope with it.
Absolutely. I mean, that said, I have to say that despite a couple of, how to describe this, enthusiastic evenings. Does that work?
Boozy, I think we can say. Just boozy.
We never really felt too bad after a night on the Santorini Assyrtiko, did we?
That is so true. I can't really explain
scientific.
it. But we felt good. Now, there were a couple more things to pick up on, but just to pause briefly at this stage, coming up, we're going to discuss Vinsanto, Assyrtiko in Burgundy, and what Santorini's future might hold. To recap so far, the ancient and majestic Assyrtiko grape variety is the key to the character and quality of Santorini's wine, which is not only supremely age-worthy, but also brilliantly food-friendly, partly because it's a bit salty. The island's wines are also being reinvented in innovative ways.
Yeah, and one thing to touch on briefly here is winemaking. As Lito mentioned, oak has been used here for ages, oak barrels. But Assyrtiko isn't a variety that takes to new oak very well. Its beauty is its aromatic subtlety. But if you use new oak, it's such an extractive juice that it just rips out all the oak character from the barrel and becomes overly oaky in flavour and texture.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem we had with a lot of the Nicteri styles. So this is a historic category on the island. Essentially, people described it in different ways, but essentially the winemaker kept the best grapes traditionally to the end of the harvest, left the grapes in the press to drain overnight, hence Nicteri, which means night, and put that free-run juice into barrels. Now, sometimes, interestingly, it could develop flor and may also have had a bit of that orange character from time draining through the skins. But mostly nowadays, this is just a fairly potent, oaky, quite alcoholic and a bit overblown style that's not really to our taste on the whole, is it?
It's often a bit sickly and overdone.
I mean, they're all different.
It's
but,
not. We certainly didn't really taste the ones that had the flor
and
the orange element to them. I think those things, but we would be better separated out and actually done in their own right and done in different ways. Yeah. But not really in that Nicteri style, which is just a sort of synonym for that oaky style. Which, for us, it didn't really work. But anyway, the historic style we really admire is the vinsantos, isn't it? I mean, these are utterly non-commercial wines, very sweet, based on Assyrtiko, or certainly all white varieties. Harvested late, sun-dried, so the grapes laid out to dry in the sun, and then they're aged for at least 2 years in old barrels, but often, much more, so a decade plus. So they've got these sort of moderate plus alcohols, high acidity, tons of sweetness, 200 to 300 plus grams per litre of sugar, usually. And then that sort of, as we discussed, salty, savoury dimension to them too. Whatever you charge for a wine like this, you're not going to make a big profit on it.
Quite. And when we said they're non-commercial, that's exactly what we meant. Because, one producer said they lose 30% on every bottle, but they have to do it for reasons of tradition. And another one said, and I quote verbatim, "You have to make Vinsanto on Santorini. You can't spit on history." Fair enough.
It's an interesting metaphor, isn't it? But these are the wines that would have made Santorini famous back in the day. You know, they're part of the history, the sort of fabric of the place. They can't lose that. You know, even if they're not the most popular style of wine these days. Apparently people used to drink them as a breakfast pick-me-up before heading out into the fields for energy.
And now there's an idea.
Not sure we could do that anymore.
There is an idea. We might have to head out in the fields just so we can drink this stuff for breakfast. But, you know, coming back to the meal in a bottle concept.
Yes, there we are.
I think the health police would definitely have something to say about that.
The breakfast angle is what sinks it, isn't it? Yeah.
I just add here, the word vinsanto, which is one word, refers to these sweet wines from Santorini. The Italian vinsanto, 2 words, is a different kettle of fish. So the Santorinians won a court case over this, establishing the historic precedence of the island's vinsanto, Vino de Santorini, back in, I think it was 2002.
I believe so. But we got onto all this by talking about oak, didn't we? And just to finish off on that, to our mind, the best dry Santorini Assyrtiko is not really about oak. It's all about relatively neutral fermentation vessels, be it, you know, concrete tanks or clay amphora or eggs, which are, I suppose just to explain, which are like big ovular shaped concrete vessels, which are quite trendy now. And then maybe aging on the yeast lees for extra texture and complexity. And then maybe a bit of bottle age too. You know, maybe older oak can work if it's used carefully, but, you know, oak is at best a bit part player here, unlike, for example, with Chardonnay, where we love it.
Yeah. Now, we're talking a lot about Assyrtiko because it is the main grape on Santorini. About 3/4 of all plantings are thought to be Assyrtiko. I mean, it's hard to be sure because lots of vineyards are mixed plantings. Yeah. In fact, I think most of them are. And just to say, for a wine to be PDO Santorini, it has to be minimum 75% Assyrtiko for dry whites, 51% minimum for Vinsanto, and it's often higher for both.
Absolutely. For a really good dry Santorini, it's sort of often 100% or very close to.
Well, close to, but they can't really say because the vineyards are mixed planting, so it's difficult for them
but they do try for that. But, you know, it's important to say, other wine grapes on the island. There used to be apparently about 100 at one stage, so some of those will have been lost. But there are white grapes like Aidani and Athiri, and in terms of reds, there's Mandilaria and Mavrotragano. And we, you know, for example, we tried one really good Mavrotragano, didn't we? It was like a cross between, I don't know, what sort of good Beaujolais and German Pinot Noir, something like that. It was an interesting one. But it can be pretty rustic, or partly due to the way it's grown and the grapes don't get necessarily super ripe. You know, we did try a good dry rosé, didn't we? And I reckon
that was lovely.
They should make more of that because, you know, visitors love it. It's the perfect place to drink it. And if you've got a fairly rustic red, maybe making a good rosé out of it is the best way to go. I don't know. But
I think they worry it would compete with Assyrtiko, though.
Oh, maybe, but there isn't that much of it, and they can make a really good one. I think. I think rosé.
I agree.
Rosé
it was
be
lovely.
A good way for it to go. Anyway, you know, really, Assyrtiko is the star here, and it absolutely should be the focus. You know, because it makes everything from sweet to fizz, but dry white wine is by far its best format.
Yeah, and Assyrtiko isn't just a star. We should say this. It isn't just a star on Santorini. You know, it's been planted all over Greece and even as far afield as Australia. So I think we can confidently predict we're going to see a lot more Assyrtiko from all around the wine world in the future.
Absolutely.
So to explain a bit more about this, here is winemaker Anastasios or Tassos Terzidis.
Assyrtiko is becoming something of an international grape star. I've seen Assyrtiko in a dozen of countries planted. I've happened to have tasted from Australia and the US. And I must admit that it has nothing to do with Santorini's Assyrtiko. The character and the outcome that you achieve in the native land, because Assyrtiko is an indigenous land of an indigenous variety of Santorini's land, cannot be achieved anywhere else. Saying that though, I find it very positive that now Assyrtiko gains such a momentum from the global wine sector. I mean, I can give you a small hint. I don't know if you are aware of that. Some universities in France are examining currently Assyrtiko as a potential substitute for some white French varieties if the so-called climatic change evolves over the next few years, because Assyrtiko, being so very well accustomed to the harsh conditions of the arid area of Santorini, is able to handle hotter areas.
Do you know which particular regions of France it might go into?
I've heard that the University of Burgundy is examining Assyrtiko as a potential substitute for the future.
Burgundy and Assyrtiko. There's a thought.
Well, when it's oaky, it does.
Forward thinking at the moment, but you can never say what's going to be.
That is a very interesting topic, though. Assyrtiko, in the context of climate change, is this grape going to be the answer for a lot of people in the face of climate change?
Yes, I believe so, because it is a highly drought-resistant variety. It is able to maintain some very desirable attributes, such as freshness, high natural acidity, even in the most hot of the areas, as is Santorini, for example.
Now, do you think you'll ever get to the stage where, obviously, Assyrtiko is a grape and a style very much associated with Santorini? Do you think you'll get to a stage where you could just produce a white wine and label it Santorini, and people will understand what that wine is without even mentioning the variety?
This is definitely our aim, to get this into a position that the generic wine consumer, not only the more trained and experienced ones, even the generic wine consumer will be able to bond Santorini with the variety, which is Assyrtiko of Santorini.
What does the future hold for Santorini?
I think we are doing very well. We must not forget that we are part of the so-called New Greek wine renaissance. Santorini is at the forefront of this wave, the number one power horse, I would say, spreading the message that Greece, apart from the long heritage in wine production as one of the first wine producing regions in the antiquity, nowadays we have highly competent wines from various areas of Greece, and Santorini is at the forefront of that. So I sense a very prosperous future.
Burgundian Assyrtiko. Now there's a thought. I'd definitely buy it.
What did we mention in our Burgundy tipping point episode? It was Savignon, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
I'd love to try Burgundian Savignon and Assyrtiko. But anyway, yes. I think the way the Santorini producers see it is great if the rest of Greece and the rest of the wine world wants to grow Assyrtiko, because that path will ultimately end with people trying Santorini Assyrtiko, which will be the pinnacle of the Assyrtiko experience.
Yes, so wine producer Stelios, who we heard from in our last episode, said pretty much exactly that.
If you ask me, for me, that the fact that there's Assyrtiko planted everywhere in Greece and in other parts of the world is great. It's proof that it's a great grape. It's proof that it's a grape that deserves to be on the pantheon of grapes. Okay, and you taste Assyrtiko from Australia and you love it. It's great, but Santorini is always going to be the top. It will open up markets, and of course, Santorini is a jewel in the crown. It's what everybody will aspire to be.
The jewel in the crown. So I think we need to finish off by looking to the future. In 50 years, Assyrtiko will no doubt be planted all over the wine world. We'll all be drinking it. But where will Santorini be?
Now, that is an excellent question. If we do the extremes, I do love a bit of drama, as you know. The doomsday scenario, if you like, will be an island ravaged by climate change, dominated by tourism, basically totally built up with wall-to-wall hotels and bars and, sunset viewpoints. Maybe with the odd blue agave cactus planted here and there to make overpriced tequila for the tourists. You're wincing, I can see. But this is doomsday, and then Australian Assyrtiko drinkers will talk wistfully about the lost Atlantis of Assyrtiko. But then the more rosy scenario would be, a vibrant wine appellation that's managed to retain its traditions, but also diversify its offering, maintaining a healthy, entirely organic vineyard with wines that people love and enjoy with their delicious meals, recognised by UNESCO, talked about enthusiastically, a jewel in the crown of global wine.
So then the question becomes, what is happening now to ensure the latter rather than the former scenario is what actually happens?
Absolutely. And we're definitely seeing sort of positive moves in that sense, aren't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, first up, there's been an injection of new blood in terms of producers on the island over the last decade. There are now about 20 in total, I think.
Yeah, that's about right.
And the newer guys are, to be honest, making some of the most impressive wines right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of renaissance is happening all over Greece, and you certainly see it on Santorini. And I think, enthusiastic, ambitious, ideally deep-pocketed new wine producers are the way forward for Santorini, especially if they can invest in developing tasting rooms and other ways to engage with the tourist industry in a way that actually benefits and supports the island's wine future.
We're also starting to see a lot more focus in the vineyards, aren't we? And tying in with this, more and more single vineyard bottlings, which I think are a really good thing to do. I mean, it means the wines can express the intricacies of the island better, plus producers can sell them for premium prices, so it makes the wine business more sustainable. It also perhaps means those sites are more protected from being sold or developed longer term.
And talking about the vineyards, we talked to a few people about efforts to restore Santorini's vineyard, replanting old vineyards and even planting new ones. And it seems this is starting to happen. There is an EU subsidised programme to replant, which is apparently bureaucratic and long, but it can be worth it. Apparently the subsidy is up to €12,000 per hectare, which is not to be sniffed at.
No, but labour is a key issue. Building work is better paid, and apparently there's not the migrant workforce there used to be. Apparently wine labour can be paid up to €100 per day, but people aren't really qualified or experienced in this work. Plus they need accommodation, which is another catch-22. Stelios said, this is what keeps us up at night.
Yeah, as do things like the fact that there's just been a huge hailstorm, hasn't there? Which means the 2023 vintage is probably down now by about 60%. For some producers, good old climate change. And one other tricky balancing act to get right is this idea to get all the island's producers to hold wine back before selling, for example, for about 6 months after the vintage, because, Santorini Assyrtiko can be quite fierce when it's young, and it improves so much in bottle. So, it makes sense.
But it's not easy. Some producers regularly run out of wine by November, but they still have to pay the bills and the salaries. So they argue they need to sell the new vintage for cash flow. But I agree, it would be far better long term to manage supply, because the wines taste so much more impressive after a bit of time in bottle. And so people will therefore like them more and pay more, and it becomes a virtuous cycle.
Yeah. So let's hear one last view on what lies ahead for the island. Here's Lito Paraskevopoulos on how she sees the future of Santorini and its wines.
I see us using tourists in the vineyards. Hopefully, well, no, I wouldn't trust that. But ideally, that would solve a lot of problems, actually. So what we need to do is protect our vineyards better. We need to work with the agronomists to settle on a clone of Assyrtiko. We need to slowly start renewing the vineyard, while also keeping the balance with the fact that those vineyards are very, very, very old. So it couldn't happen all at once. So we couldn't uproot everything and plant again, because that would potentially have a detrimental effect on the typicality, which has been built upon the behavior of vineyards that are officially 300 years old, but that's just the start of the paperwork. The reality is a lot older, but we couldn't tell you. They've just been here this entire time. They've been here since we know. So we do need to protect the vineyard legally, especially. So I'd hope to pressure the authorities to do a better job of protecting the vineyard being built upon. And then, of course, the work that has also been underway, so would be to communicate to the world the terroir, the variety, starting with the classic style, so as not to confuse the situation too much, and then slowly starting bringing in the vast array of different styles that we can make.
And in the meantime, use the tourists that come here to work. It's somehow in the winery.
And pay us for the experience. That's the one. Yeah.
Well, that sounds fantastic. We'll certainly do that. You can put us to work anytime.
Oh yeah, easy. It's done.
I think you've just signed up for some hard labour there.
I signed us up. If you listen carefully.
Fine. I'll be the one supervising your work from a terrace with a glass of chilled Assyrtiko in my hand.
I see, that's how it works as well.
Just experimenting.
You know what? If that's what it takes to save Santorini wine, I'm totally ready to slip into my Marvel costume and become Captain Santorini. It's all about attracting a superior kind of tourist. That's the thing.
And I think that's a very good moment to bring the curtain down on this episode. What an adventure it's been. Thank you for joining us. By way of summary, Santorini is a special place with special, historic, delicious, exciting and increasingly diverse wines. But this ancient, unique, irreplaceable vineyard and its wine community is threatened by perils like climate change and overdevelopment due to the booming tourism industry.
Now, though, the Santorini wine empire is fighting back. Vines are being replanted. The younger generation is coming through. Impressive new producers are helping raise quality and visibility. There's an ambitious plan to declare the entire PDO Santorini wine appellation organic, which definitely they should try to do. A UNESCO appellation has been submitted, and growers are clubbing together to try to agree minimum aging periods and communicate the joys of these wines to the world. This all bodes well.
And time will tell. I think perhaps a good quote to end on is one from Konstantinos Lazarakis, MW, who in his book The Wines of Greece writes, "To lose viticulture here would be an immense loss. The real aim today should be not just to preserve Santorini, but to realise its full potential."
And that's a really exciting notion, one we're only too delighted to support, mainly by drinking the wines in bucket loads. Our thanks to Lito, Stelios, Tassos, Yanis and Wines of PDO Santorini. And of course, thanks to you for listening. Until next time, cheers.